They called him many things throughout his 7 decades on this earth: the poet, the preacher, the last soul man. But for a long time, the public record was dominated by a different narrative, a whisper that followed him into every room and every recording booth. He's the guy who married Sam Cooke's wife. It's a peculiar habit of history to focus on the shadow a man casts, rather than the light he carries. To understand why Bobby Womack became one of the most polarizing and brilliant figures in American music, we have to look past the scandals and the pariah years. We have to go back to a time when black boys in the industrial North were often expected to simply disappear into the machinery of the city. The year was 1944. In post-war Cleveland, Ohio, the American dream was a gated community, and Bobby Womack was living on the outside of the fence. Home was a one-room shack on the east side, where the winter wind didn't just blow. It searched for cracks in the windows to remind you that you were unwanted. In the Womack household, hunger wasn't a stranger. It was a nightly guest that sat at the table with 5 growing boys and 2 exhausted parents. Their father, Friendly Womack, was a steelworker by trade and a gospel singer by blood. He was a man of stern, uncompromising faith who saw life as a battlefield between the Lord and the devil. Their mother, Naomi, was the silent architect of their survival. When their stomachs ached so loudly they couldn't sleep, Friendly would call it fasting for Jesus. But Naomi knew the truth of the ghetto. She looked at her sons and gave them the only map out of the poverty that threatened to swallow them. Sing, boys. Sing your way out of this place. Bobby, the 3rd son, was the lightning rod of the family, bold, defiant, and possessed by a restless energy. The defining moment of his musical DNA happened by accident, or perhaps by fate. Bobby had been secretly playing his father's guitar while the old man was at work. One afternoon, a string snapped. In the Womack house, breaking a tool of the trade was a sin that invited the belt. When Friendly discovered the broken string, he offered Bobby a terrifying ultimatum: "I'm going to whip you, unless you can show me you can actually play that thing." There was one problem. Friendly was right-handed. Bobby was left-handed. Without the time to restring the instrument or the money to buy a new one, Bobby did something that would define the frequency of soul music for the next 50 years. He flipped the guitar upside down. He strummed with his left hand, hitting the heavy bass strings at the bottom and the high trebles at the top. The rhythm was awkward at first, then it became raw, then it became something so honest and haunting that it brought tears to his father's eyes. Friendly didn't reach for his belt. He reached for a vision. That was the night the Womack brothers were born. They began traveling through the small, dusty towns of the Midwest, performing in storefront churches and tents. They shared stages with the giants of the gospel highway, groups like the 5 Blind Boys and the Soul Stirrers. It was there, amidst the sweat and the spirit of the pews, that Bobby first laid eyes on a young, magnetic singer named Sam Cooke. Sam was the golden child of the gospel world, handsome, smooth, and possessing a voice that could make even the most hardened sinner believe in grace again. He saw the same hunger in Bobby that he felt in himself. He leaned in and gave the boy a piece of advice that would become a lifeline: "Keep singing. Don't ever stop. I'll help you when the time comes." Bobby didn't know it then, but he was holding a tiger by the tail. He was singing his way out of the ghetto, just like his mother told him, but he was heading straight into a fire that would nearly consume his legacy before it even began. By the early 1960 seconds, Bobby Womack's life was accelerating at a pace that far outstripped his understanding of the world. The church boy from Cleveland was now living in the neon-soaked sprawl of Los Angeles, rubbing shoulders with the elite of the black music industry. His mentor, Sam Cooke, had become a titan of American culture. Sam wasn't just a singer anymore. He was a label owner, a savvy businessman, and a cultural prophet. He saw in Bobby a raw, unpolished version of his own ambition, a student in a new kind of classroom where the primary subjects were rhythm, the logistics of the road, and the hidden, heavy cost of crossover success. Under Sam's surgical guidance, the Womack brothers were rebranded as the Valentinos. Sam didn't just give them a record deal. He gave them a sound, the sharp Italian suits, and the access to the Chitlin Circuit, the network of venues safe for black performers during the height of Jim Crow. Bobby wasn't just another player in the background, he was Sam's shadow. He spent hours in the studio at SAR Records, watching Sam navigate the predatory nature of the industry. It was here Bobby learned the most vital lesson of his life. Talent feeds your soul, but ownership is the only thing that feeds your family. But as the hits like "Lookin' for a Love" began to climb the R&B charts, the investigative record shows a darkening in the atmosphere. Following the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, Sam Cooke's spirit underwent a radical shift. He began reading the works of Malcolm X and James Baldwin. He stopped straightening his hair and started talking about justice, power, and the black economic future. The music followed the man. Sam wrote a song that would become the anthem of an entire movement. "A Change Is Gonna Come." The forensic trail of that song is haunted. When Sam played the demo for Bobby in a quiet studio session, he didn't ask about its radio potential. He asked for Bobby's raw intuition. Bobby's response was immediate and visceral. He told Sam, "Man, that song sounds like death." Sam didn't argue or laugh. He looked away, distant, and told Bobby he felt the song hadn't come from him, but through him like a final warning he was forced to deliver to the world. The warning came to pass with terrifying, clinical speed. In December 1964, just a week after Sam had let the Valentinos go from his label to cut costs, a move he promised was only a temporary business maneuver, the unthinkable happened. Sam Cooke was shot dead at the Hacienda Motel in Los Angeles, under circumstances that remain a labyrinth of rumors, contradictions, and conspiracy theories. The news hit Bobby Womack like a physical blow. His mentor, his protector, and the architect of his entire future was gone in a flash of gunfire. The investigation into the aftermath reveals a funeral that was more like a cultural riot. Fans screamed, women fainted, and the music world stood in a state of paralyzed shock. Standing beside the casket was Sam's widow, Barbara Cooke, broken, beautiful, and suddenly alone in a den of corporate wolves and hangers-on. Somewhere inside Bobby Womack, a circuit snapped. He claimed it was loyalty. He claimed he wanted to protect Sam's legacy and his family from the men circling Barbara's house looking for money. He moved in, supposedly as a guardian. Others, however, began to see the cold reality of an obsession. When Barbara eventually told Bobby, "You keep running my boyfriends off, I guess you'll have to be my man," he didn't resist. He stepped into the king's shoes. They married just 3 months after Sam Cooke was put in the ground. With that single, impulsive decision, the Prat Ka became the usurper in the eyes of the public. Bobby Womack went from being the heir apparent of soul to being the most hated man in Black America. He had ignored the prophecy of the music, and now he was about to face a scandal that would bury his career before he ever had a chance to truly begin. In the cold, analytical world of true crime, we often look for the crime of passion. For Bobby Womack, his marriage to Barbara Cooke was exactly that, a reckless, impulsive act that the public viewed not as love, but as the ultimate desecration of a fallen hero. When the news broke that the 1-year-old Prody had married his mentor's widow just 3 months after Sam Cooke's body was lowered into the ground, the reaction was not just negative, it was nuclear. Bobby wasn't just a singer anymore. He was a symbol of parasitic opportunism. The investigative record shows a total, systematic blacklisting that would have crushed a lesser man. Radio stations across the country, the same ones that had heralded him as the next, Sam Cooke, refused to touch a Womack record. Promoters canceled his shows, fearing that his presence would incite riots. On the rare occasions he managed to get on stage, the audience didn't cheer. They booed him with a visceral hatred until he was forced to retreat into the wings, humiliated. He had become a ghost in his own industry. But the streets had their own form of justice, more brutal than any radio ban. Sam's brother, Charlie Cooke, saw the marriage as a blood insult. When he caught up with Bobby in a Chicago hotel, the confrontation was a one-sided slaughter. Charlie beat Bobby so severely that his jaw was shattered, his teeth pushed through his lip, and his face rendered unrecognizable. It was a physical manifestation of the community's rage, a message written in blood that Bobby Womack was no longer welcome in the world Sam Cooke had built. Yet, the investigation into Bobby's psyche reveals a man who possessed a pathological inability to stop moving. If the world wouldn't let him be a star, he would become the engine behind the stars. This began the era of the ghost musician. Bobby retreated into the shadows of the recording studios, lending his unique, upside-down guitar style to the legends who were still allowed to walk in the light. He became the secret weapon for Ray Charles. Working for Ray was a masterclass in high-stakes survival. Bobby described it as living in a hurricane with a backbeat. Ray was brilliant but reckless, a man who would drive cars while blind and navigate dangerous drug deals with a terrifying indifference. From Ray's camp, Bobby moved to the volatile world of Wilson Pickett. The two were kindred spirits, wild, immensely talented, and fueled by a destructive mixture of soul and cocaine. Bobby wrote, "I'm a midnight mover, and I'm in love," for Pickett, effectively defining the sound of late 60-second soul, while his own name remained a footnote in the credits. However, as the investigation digs deeper into the Womack Cooke household, the loyalty Bobby claimed to have for Sam's family began to reveal its toxic, tangled underbelly. The marriage to Barbara was never a sanctuary. It was a battlefield of guilt, resentment, and mutual self-destruction. In 1970, the scandal reached a horrific new peak that would permanently sever Bobby from any hope of immediate redemption. Barbara discovered that Bobby was having an affair with Linda Cooke, Sam Cooke's teenage daughter and Barbara's own child. The forensic record of that night is a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos. Barbara didn't call a lawyer. She grabbed a .32 caliber pistol and fired a shot directly at Bobby's head. The bullet grazed his temple, missing its mark by mere inches. Bobby fled the house in his underwear, running for his life as his world collapsed for the second time. Linda would eventually go on to marry Bobby's own brother, Cecil Womack, creating a family tree so knotted with trauma, betrayal, and genius that it became the stuff of dark industry legend. Bobby Womack was now in exile in every sense of the word. He had burned through the goodwill of the church, the respect of his peers, and the safety of his home. As he stood on the precipice of the 1,970 seconds, out of work and sinking deeper into a heavy cocaine habit, he realized that the only thing he had left was his guitar and the pain that had become his only honest companion. He was about to take that pain and turn it into the greatest soundtrack of the street ever recorded, proving that even a pariah can still sing the truth. By the dawn of the 1,970 seconds, Bobby Womack had learned a brutal, inescapable lesson of the American dream. In this country, you can be a genius and a monster in the exact same heartbeat. He was still a pariah in the polite, air-conditioned offices of the mainstream music industry, but out on the sun-scorched asphalt of the streets, his voice was beginning to sound like the only truth left. He had finally stopped trying to be the next Sam Cooke, a ghost he could never outrun, and started being the first Bobby Womack. He was a man who sang with a gravelly, gut-wrenching honesty that didn't just sound like music, it sounded like a legal deposition from the soul. The investigative peak of this era arrived in 1972 with the soundtrack for the blaxploitation film Across 110th Street. The title track wasn't just a radio hit, it was a forensic field report from the front lines of the urban struggle. It spoke of the hustlers, the pimps, and the everyday survivors of Harlem with a precision that only someone who had lived on the edge could provide. 110th Street was the dividing line between the affluent Central Park and the neglected tenements of Harlem, and Bobby's music became the bridge between those two Americas. It fused the grit of the soul era with the burgeoning, aggressive pulse of funk, proving that Womack's perspective was the essential narrative of the black experience. But as his creative light burned white-hot, the shadows in his personal life were growing long, cold, and lethal. Behind the velvet curtains of the recording studios, the investigation reveals a man losing a desperate, silent war to cocaine. Bobby described his addiction as a frantic attempt to get high enough to escape himself, but the higher the chemicals took him, the more gravity punished him on the way down. In 1970, he sat in a haze of drug smoke with a young, equally haunted Janis Joplin. They spent nights writing "Trust Me" and sharing the kind of late-night confessions only the doomed can understand. Only hours after their final session together, Joplin was found dead of a heroin overdose. Her death should have been a final warning shot, a flare in the dark, but Bobby's nervous system was too numb to register the danger. He was becoming a man who lived exclusively in the presence of ghosts, and soon the ghosts began to claim his own bloodline. In 1974, tragedy struck the Womack family with the surgical precision of a Greek tragedy. Bobby's brother, Harry Womack, was found stabbed to death in Bobby's own home. The killer was a jealous lover who believed Harry was with another woman. The investigative files describe a scene of grotesque irony. Harry was killed during a domestic dispute, while one of Bobby's own records was playing in the background. For Bobby, the guilt was not just emotional, it was a physical weight that threatened to crush his chest. He was the one who had brought his brothers out of Cleveland and into the neon trap of Los Angeles, and now he was the one presiding over their open caskets. But the most devastating evidence of Bobby's total moral and physical spiral came from the loss of his children, the kind of evidence that stays locked in the cold case files of a man's heart. In 1978, his infant son, Truth, suffocated after falling into a gap between a wall and a bed. The horror of the incident was exponentially magnified by the investigative detail that Bobby was allegedly in another room at the time, so incapacitated by a cocaine binge that he was physically unable to hear his child's final struggle for air. It was a trauma that would have ended the sanity of most men. And yet, the forensic record of his creativity shows that even in the absolute floor of this darkness, Bobby kept the tape rolling. He channeled the horror of Truth's death and the subsequent suicide of his oldest son, Vincent, who took his own life at the age of 21, into his music. He recorded If You Think You're Lonely Now and Communication, songs that didn't just contain pain, they were constructed out of it. By the late 70s, Bobby Womack was a legend without a home, a man who had buried his mentor, his brother, his friends, and his children. He was the poet of pain, because his life had become a poem written in the ink of blood and the rhythm of the blues. He had reached the limits of what a human soul could endure, and the world began to wonder, how much more could the last soul man lose before the music finally stopped for good? In the cold, unforgiving logic of the American music industry, Bobby Womack should have been a footnote by the time the 1,980 seconds arrived. To the executives in Los Angeles and New York, he was too old for the neon glitter of the disco craze, too dark for the increasingly sanitized, crossover-obsessed pop charts, and he carried far too much historical baggage for the image-driven era of MTV. In his own country, he was still the guy who married Barbara, a man whose personal scandals acted as a permanent barricade to his professional survival. But as our investigation shifts across the Atlantic, we find a starkly different story. In Europe, and specifically in the underground, soul-obsessed culture of the United Kingdom, Bobby Womack wasn't a scandal, he was a sovereign. While white America tried to polish away the impurities of black music to make it safer for the suburbs, the European soul scene adored the grit. To them, Bobby's gravelly, unrefined voice and his upside-down guitar style were the gold standard of authenticity. He didn't have to apologize for his past in London, Manchester, or Paris. In those cities, his scars were his credentials. The investigative records of his European tours in the 80 seconds and 90 seconds show sold-out theaters filled with fans who treated him with a level of reverence usually reserved for religious icons. Bobby himself noted this bizarre cultural divide with a mixture of gratitude and bitterness. They love you when you make them dance, but in America they don't want to see where the song came from. They want the fruit, not the roots. In Europe, they want to know about every drop of blood in the lyrics. But the most significant bridge Bobby Womack built wasn't just geographical, it was generational. As the 1,980 seconds gave way to the 90 seconds, a seismic movement was rising from the cracked pavement of New York and Los Angeles, hip-hop. The pioneers of this new sound were looking for a sonic foundation, and they found it in the raw, unfiltered honesty of Bobby's records. Young producers began the process of sampling, digitally dissecting musical fragments to create a new pulse. They weren't just stealing melodies, they were borrowing his soul. When a rapper sampled Across 110th Street, they were connecting their modern struggle in the projects of the 90 seconds to the urban battlefield Bobby had documented 2 decades earlier. The forensic trail of modern R&B and hip-hop is literally littered with Womack's DNA. Artists like Tupac Shakur, The Roots, and later Kendrick Lamar looked to him as the godfather of truth. He became the essential connective tissue between the church-born soul of the 50 seconds and the street-born rap of the 90 seconds. He was the one man who had survived long enough to tell the younger generation that their anger and their pain were part of a long, noble tradition of resistance. In the late 90 seconds and early 2000s, this resurgence caught the attention of some unlikely allies in the world of global pop culture. Filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino understood that Bobby's voice carried an inherent cinematic weight that couldn't be faked. By using Across 110th Street as the opening anthem for his film Jackie Brown, Tarantino introduced Bobby's voice to a massive generation of white suburban kids who had never even heard of Sam Cooke. Then came Damon Albarn of Gorillaz. Albarn didn't just want to sample a ghost, he wanted the man himself. The investigation into the recording of the Plastic Beach album in 2010 reveals a Bobby Womack who was initially hesitant, a man who didn't understand why these British kids with their synthesizers wanted his raspy, aging voice. But Albarn understood what the American industry had forgotten, that Bobby Womack's voice carried the history of a century within its folds. When Bobby sang on the track Stylo, he wasn't just a guest feature or a novelty act, he was the ghost in the machine, the ancient, blood-stained soul giving weight and meaning to a digital world. Bobby Womack had become a living bridge. He had survived the death of soul, the rise of disco, the devastation of the crack era, and the birth of the digital age. He had moved from being a pariah to being a pioneer, proving that the truth doesn't have an expiration date and that pain, if sang honestly enough, is the only universal language. He had outlived his enemies, his harshest critics, and most of his peers. He was now ready for the final, redemptive act of his life, a period where he would finally stop running from his mistakes and start outliving them. In the cold, clinical geometry of a downward spiral, there is a point where the momentum becomes absolute and unstoppable. By the late 1970 seconds, Bobby Womack had reached that point. The investigative record of this period doesn't just reveal a fading career. It reveals a human soul being dismantled, piece by piece, by the very demons he invited into his home. The poet of pain was no longer just writing about suffering as an observer, he was drowning in it as a victim. The forensic center of this darkness was a relentless, all-consuming addiction to cocaine. In the high-stakes, high-octane world of 1970 seconds, Los Angeles, the drug was a ubiquitous social lubricant. But for Bobby, it wasn't a party favor, it was a burial shroud. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to numb the memory of Sam Cooke, the sting of the industry's betrayal, and the chaos of his domestic life. The records show a man who would spend days locked in recording studios, fueled by white powder and a growing, razor-edged paranoia. He was creating some of the most haunting music of the era, but while the tapes were rolling, his physical reality was rotting from the inside out. But the systemic cost, the Hollywood bill, we've discussed throughout this dossier, doesn't just collect money or fame, it eventually collects lives. The investigation into the Womack bloodline during this decade reads like a Greek tragedy written in the stark, unfeeling ink of a police report. First, the blow came from his own brotherhood, Harry Womack. Harry was more than a sibling. He was Bobby's last living link to the innocent, hungry days of Cleveland. When Harry was found stabbed to death in Bobby's own home in 1974, the investigators' notes describe a scene of senseless, domestic horror. Bobby wasn't just losing a brother, he was losing his foundation. He was the one who had led his brothers out of the sanctuary of the church and into the line of fire. The guilt began to calcify in his chest, a leaden weight that no amount of chemicals could lift. Then came the year that would permanently break the man behind the music, 1978. The death of his infant son, Truth, is the most harrowing chapter in this entire file. The investigative details are a gut punch to anyone seeking a hero in this story. Truth died of suffocation, a freak accident involving a gap between a bed and a wall. But the shadow that never left Bobby, the shadow that fueled his nightmares, was the allegation that he was in another room, lost in a cocaine-induced stupor, physically and mentally unable to hear his son's final, desperate struggle for air. How does a man survive that knowledge? The record shows that Bobby didn't go to a clinic. He went back to the studio. He channeled that unbearable localized hell into the album Roads of Life. But the universe wasn't finished with its collections. Only a few years later, his oldest son, Vincent, took his own life at the age of 21. The poet of pain was now burying the very children he had hoped would carry his name into a better future. At this stage of the investigation, we see a Bobby Womack who is little more than a map of open wounds. He had buried his mentor, his brother, and now two of his sons. He was a man who lived in a house full of ghosts, and yet he still had to go out and perform across 110th Street for cheering crowds who only wanted to dance. This is the soul man's true burden, the cruel industry expectation that you must keep the rhythm even when your heart has stopped beating. By 1982, Bobby was physically and spiritually decimated. He was a walking cold case, a man whom everyone assumed would be the next tragic headline in the "died too soon" column of music history. But the investigation doesn't end in the graveyard. Bobby Womack was about to do the one thing no one expected. He was going to outlive his own destruction. Some stories don't need a happy ending to be legendary. They just need an honest one. As we seal the investigative dossier on Bobby Womack, we are forced to confront a truth that the entertainment industry often tries to sanitize. That a man can be a genius and a sinner, a poet and a pariah, all within the same heartbeat. Bobby Womack lived his life in the public square, and he paid every cent of the Hollywood bill we have deconstructed in this series. But while the industry took his youth, his reputation, and his peace, it could never reclaim the frequency he discovered on that upside-down guitar in Cleveland. The legacy of Bobby Womack isn't found in a bank account or even in the gold records hanging in a boardroom. It is found in the very DNA of modern music. When we look at the landscape of 21st century art, we are looking at a world that Bobby helped build with his own blood. Every artist who uses a raw, unpolished vocal to express a deep, internal pain is an heir to the Womack tradition. He was the last soul man, because he was the last one who refused to use a filter, even when the world was screaming at him to cover his scars. In America, we are often obsessed with the myth of perfection, but Bobby Womack reminded us of the devastating beauty of the flawed. His life was a sermon written in the language of the blues. He didn't just sing about love, he sang about the betrayal that often follows it. He didn't just sing about survival, he sang about the ghosts that haunt the survivor. His voice, that raspy, gut-wrenching cry, became a mirror for an entire nation. In Across 110th Street, he captured the heartbeat of a divided L.A. and a struggling Harlem, proving that the street corner is just as sacred as the church altar if you tell the absolute truth about what happens there. The investigation into his final years reveals a man who had finally stopped running. In 2009, when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the public verdict shifted for good. He stood on that stage, having outlived the Sam Cooke scandal and the cocaine binges, and uttered the line that defined his redemption: "I thank God for letting me outlive my mistakes." It was a moment of profound psychological repair. He had lived long enough to be forgiven, not because he pleaded for it, but because his music had become so essential that the culture simply couldn't function without it. He proved that redemption isn't a final destination. It's the exhausting, noble act of staying in the race until the very end. Even as his health failed, with Alzheimer's and cancer closing in, the record shows he never stopped testifying. His final album, The Bravest Man in the Universe, wasn't a play for the charts. It was an exit interview. When he passed away in his sleep on the 27th of June, 2014, there was no final scandal. There was only a profound silence, the kind of silence that follows a long, difficult prayer. Today, when you hear a Womack record playing in a distant club or sampled in a new hip-hop anthem, you aren't just hearing a song. You are hearing a witness. You are hearing the boy who played a broken guitar in a one-room shack, singing his way out of the ghetto and straight into the halls of eternity. He showed us that soul is not something you possess, it's something you do. It's the way you stand up after the world has knocked you down for the 1,000th time. The investigation into Bobby Womack is over. The pariah has been redeemed. The ghost has become a legend, and as we turn off the studio lights, his voice remains a raspy, righteous reminder that the only thing more powerful than a mistake is the soul that refuses to let that mistake be the final word. Rest in power, Bobby Womack. The last soul man has finally found his grace.